Hi, my name is Ali Hamza, and I'm going to be presenting my essay on for the final project of philosophy and literature. My title is The Critique of MacIntyre's Strife with Liberalism. The thesis of my paper simply states that MacIntyre's critique of liberalism is a bit misconstrued and that he misses a few ideas about liberalism which and uh, has an unfair outlook towards it. And I use arguments from people such as Rawls and Kant to further this argument, and I'm using literary texts from such as the Metamorphosis, The Great Gatsby, and Antigone as my historical and literary signifiers. So before I begin the main part of my essay, I take a few paragraphs to talk about what makes ethics and social order so intertwined. The idea is something that McIntyre himself also agrees with, and this idea begins from the fact that all ethical frameworks are built on the idea that humans are interacting with each other, and in order for them to interact with each other, there must be a certain framework or a certain social order that they must uh, possess, and this can be seen in Kant's ethical framework, where he assumes all agents are free to take their own decisions, and social order then becomes a liberal or social order, or something like the biblical social order, which is not so defined, and the Homeric social order, where people are working towards a common good. And then this idea then leads to this idea that if we are debating between various ethical ideas, then we could also then be debating about various social orders. And in my paper, we're talking about communitarianism and liberalism primarily. So Kant, MacIntyre sets up a few ideas in his book After Virtue, and these ideas are important to his argument on the communal life. He begins his first idea, which is known as a practice, and a practice is anything that a human does. And for this, he uses an example of a little girl playing chess with the promise of a candy for winning. And he posits that the little girl could cheat to win the candy, but if she plays the chess game fairly, she would come to realize that there's a certain reward that comes from playing chess in itself, and he describes this reward as an internal good of a practice, and then the candy becomes an external good of a practice. And from this idea, he leads to this idea that practices are social activities that people do together. So he posits that politics can be a practice. And from these practices, and in order for these practices to happen, humans must possess a virtue. And he defines a virtue by this idea. He defines virtue by going through various older traditions, pre-modern traditions, where he expands on how they used virtue, and then he comes up with his own definition of a virtue. And he highlights three important virtues, which are honesty, courage, and justice. And then he says that there can be many more virtues as well. And then he talks about an idea of a tradition. To MacIntyre, a tradition is an argument that has lived through time. And this tradition comes through various changes and definitions and redefinitions that happen over time, and the tradition could completely dissolve and reform itself anew. And this leads to an idea of a living tradition. A living tradition is something that people live inside, and it can have external conflict, agents that are external to it who are in conflict with it, and they are aiming to they disagree with most of it or all of it. And then there are agents inside the living tradition who are constantly critiquing it in order to refine it, which leads to a communal uh, life where people are living in a tradition. They have a certain ethical system or ethical ideas and virtues, and this is kind of where MacIntyre leans towards a communitarian position. MacIntyre critiques liberalism by constantly throughout his work by critiquing Kant and critiquing Hume and Mill and various other philosophers of the Enlightenment era. One such philosopher that Kant critiques, who's not an enlightenment but a liberal philosopher, is his, and he critiques his theory of justice. And he says, and this theory of justice that Rawls produces is a theory on distributive justice. And he begins with this idea that all humans are within a veil of ignorance before they enter a society, and before they enter the society they don't know about their own class, their own status, their own aims, talents, economic, cultural, or political inclinations, and they just are aiming to agree on a set of rules that form a good life. And through this idea, argues that no one is going to be able to create a world where someone is disadvantaged and someone is not. And in this, he creates two principles. The first being that each person is to have an equal right to a system of basic liberties, and in this everyone should have one. And then the second principle states that is twofold, where he says that social economic inequalities are to be arranged so that the maximum benefit can be given to the least advantaged, and we can attach this political this idea of equality of opportunity to a political institution. And he gives the first one um, priority over the the A part of the second principle priority over the B part. McIntyre critiques liberalism and the ethical systems of liberalism throughout his book, and the biggest critique he presents is the incommensurability and the incompatibility between liberal ideas. And he says that these have a tendency to fall into emotivism, where no ethics system of ethics is really correct, and there is no universalizability. He specifically he specifically critiques Rawls's system theory of justice against another thinker known as Nozick, who presents another theory of justice, and he says that they are simply incommensurable. He begins this idea by talking about two people who A and B, who have different inclinations, and one person wants to be entitled to everything that he's worked and deserves, and the other person talks about that everyone should be given the basic amount of liberties before they are given things. And this idea, to McIntyre says, leads to this idea that these two theories of justice are entirely incommensurable, and this is a big problem with all ethical paradigms within the liberal school of thought. Another critique he presents is that all liberal schools of thoughts are vastly isolated from context. You could take an example of Kant, who presents a very abstract ethical system where a person is only classified as a rational agent and nothing else, and he ignores the idea of irrationality or the idea of privilege or other sociological ideas. And McIntyre has a strife with this idea. He also calls he also says that Rawls is also impractical because of the fact that he has there's no veil of ignorance, and that Nozick is also isolated from context because there is no fair acquisition if something that the first acquisition was theft. And here he's referencing the idea of colonizers stealing land from indigenous nations. He also talks about this idea of desert, which he says does not exist uh, in liberal school forms of theories of justice. And he says that this ancient idea is an important factor, and it does not exist in liberal schools of thought. And he also calls them impractical because of the reasons that he's given above. Then we come to, I want to evaluate the different critiques McIntyre presents and look at them in the context of liberalism. The first idea that comes to mind when we look at McIntyre's theory is that he's asking for a complete overhaul of the current world, because the current world may not be following strict paradigms of liberalism, but it's definitely closer to liberalism than it is to something like communitarianism. And this challenging the core of modern society as a solution to the problems that are present in our present ethical dilemmas leaves no space for reparation, because there is no way the world can turn into a communitarian society without a complete overhaul. And this overhaul and this overthrow of the present system leads to the sacrifice of the people in the present, because the people in the present are suffering, and their problems do not go away by a solution that can only be enacted about centuries later, because it takes time for such a change in the system to present itself. And this runs contrary to his initial stance on good, where he says that good can't be quantified. So then, for him to sacrifice the the good of the people in the present for the good of the people in the future feels contrary to what his stance was against utilitarianism. Another aspect of the communal life is the idea of of the human tendency towards individualism. Humans themselves humans who can think for themselves have this idea that they want have this need to critique the current system, and this critique and this idea to constantly think for themselves leads to humans being able to accumulate uh, a certain following or a certain will to act on those ideas. And this example can be taken from Antigone, who's being oppressed by by a king, and here her oppression is that she can't bury her brother, and this is simply unjustifiable to her, and she cannot withstand such an idea. So she goes on to do what she rationally derives is to be the moral act, and in this idea of choice, she embraces her individuality more than the communal good. And McIntyre talks about this idea of humans having a choice or a different ought, but he does not define it well enough for this to be a reasonable way, and it almost seems emotivistic in some ways. However, Antigone is also liberal in her stances, because if we look at it from the perspective of Rawls, her brother deserved a few basic liberties, and Antigone acted to make sure that she gets them, and she also is. And this idea makes her, in some degree, individualist and liberal. And then from this we can talk about the idea of accumulation of power within individuals. If Antigone could do something as grave as denying uh, the king, then it can be posited that humans have the will to subjugate others as well under themselves, and this accumulation of power in a society that's uh, geared towards communal good can lead to a lot of problems, as history tells us. Furthermore, one more thing that I'd like to add about the idea of ought is that Antigone chooses a moral idea over another, which leads to the death of various other people. And McIntyre says that this choice is almost as if this choice doesn't undo the other choice. However, in this case, it does undo it, and it does kill people, and this simply does not make sense. Another idea that can occur is the idea that traditions can become emotivist. If two traditions come and clash together, their ethical systems can clash and cause a problem. I use a construction of two societies, A and B. One who doesn't believe in the idea of clothes because they come from a premise that humans are close to nature and nature doesn't have clothes in it. And then another society that believes that humans are different from nature, and then they employ clothes to act out on that difference. And if these societies come together, it they won't be able to find a a commensurable decision or a compatible, they won't be able to be compatible with each other's, and this almost leads to an emotivistic idea, and we see something like this in colonialism, where two different ideas collide, and one one tradition enforces itself over the other, and it's almost emotivistic in that sense, and this leads to, various emotivist issues. Another problem with McIntyre's representation of liberalism is that he stereotypes liberals with emotivists. His entire critique of emotivism is makes a lot of sense, but he misrepresents liberals. And we can talk about this using an example of Jay Gatsby from the Grey Gatsby, who rarely ever justifies or attempts to justify any of his decisions rationally. He's consistently he's consistently haphazard, and he is a true embodiment of emotivism. However, in the real world, such characters are rare, if not barely ever present. And in the real world, liberals try to use their individuality to fight for social change and social causes. And if a community was geared towards social good, this would limit those liberals from acting out on those rational, ethical imperatives. And then McIntyre also, in this idea of a tradition and the idea of a communal good, McIntyre does not McIntyre ignores the possible suffocation of the individual. The common good may not be for everyone, and not everyone may be interested in the common good. And a certain a twisted example could be Gregor Samsa, whose tradition could be to help the family and to uh, and to be of help to the family, and his job and his work could then be a practice. But what if the virtues that come from his job don't suit him, and he just can't leave his job because that's a practice he's involved with, and in that he loses himself and alienates himself, and this alienation is ignored in lieu of the social good, and that's something that McIntyre should address. So yeah, and that's my entire critique. A final word I would suggest is that liberalism is much more nuanced than the various disadvantages present within it, and so is a communitarian life, and so is a libertarian life. And the idea to disregard a school of thought entirely based on empirical evidences is a bit harsh in my opinion, and that's my paper. Thank you so much.